program. I will just take a couple of moments for introductions while our audience is settling in. I am Irina Tsakhreli. I'm a practicing architect and an educator in New York, currently instructing and directing the residency program for T-Space. And with us is Maxwell Funk, also an architect and the residency administrator. Hi, Max. For our new audience, T-Space is a non-profit organization. It's an initiative of the Stephen Myron Hall Foundation, and it focuses on arts, education, design, and ecology. T-Space introduced the architecture residency program 5 years ago. The program is annual, and it is a 25-day intensive, which takes place every July. The program is urging its residents to design and think critically. And this year, the theme and design prompt is a continuation of last year's transformation of consciousness. I'm grateful that our scholarship program is growing. All our residents this year have received either partial or a full scholarship, thanks to the very generous support of Steve Pulimud, Silwan Engineers, the Al-Hel Foundation, and the Art of Building in Rhinebeck, among other supporters. We do welcome your support as well to make more scholarships possible in the future and to help T-Space carry out its mission in education. You may like to consider making a contribution now. Just click on the link in the chat and we'll be very, very grateful. In addition to the residency program, T-Space organizes a couple of what we call the synthesis of the arts events at the intersection of art, architecture, music, and poetry. Our first synthesis event was called Raptures and Reconciliations, and it is on show now at the T-Space Gallery in Rhinebeck. You can schedule a visit by clicking at the calendar invite, also available in our chat. The second synthesis of event for 2021 is coming up by the end of August. It is called Suspended Collapse. It features Lead Pencil Studio, poetry by Lisa Robertson, and music by Lester St. Louis. Also in the chat, you can find ways to register for this event. Lead Pencil will also lecture for us this Thursday. Keep an eye out for that as well. Most of our programming, same as last year, is visual, yet T-Space Gallery in Rhinebeck opened its door just yesterday for in-person visits by appointment only every Sunday until the end of September. I would also like to encourage you to join our mailing list to receive announcements firsthand, and you can also consider subscribing to our YouTube channel where you can have access to all T-Space public events and lectures that are being recorded. It's an incredible resource, very highly recommended. With that, I would like to welcome our residents. They make up a very strong panel here. We have with us Yolanda Wen, Brian Hartman, Megan Pisarczyk, and Jack Watthew, as well as Alexander and Reggie, who will also be moderating today's event. Reggie Mays will lead our Q&A. Reggie holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts and currently is pursuing a Master's in Architecture at the University of Idaho. And Alexander, practicing architect, holds a Bachelor of Architecture and a Bachelor of Fine Arts. And as a RISD graduate and former student of Kyna, I will pass it on to you now, Alexander, to introduce our main guest, Kyna Leski. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Irene. It is my pleasure to introduce Kyna Leski, a maker, writer, actor, teacher and student, and architect. Kyna wears all of these hats in the service of an exploration of the creative process, a process that reveals the difficult relationship of stated intention to experience and the transsubjectivity between. As an educator, Kyna is dedicated to embodied learning, to the precision of mind that comes from measured making, and to the clarity of abstraction. She's a revered professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, where I had the pleasure, like many others, to experience her incredible dedication to her students. And she has served as the department head and head of RISD's European Honors Program in Rome. Kyna has given talks from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, to PopTech in Camden, Maine. And she's the author of The Storm of Creativity, published by the MIT Press in 2015, which is translated into Turkish, Russian, Chinese, and Korean. Kyna received her Bachelor's of Architecture from the Cooper Union and her Master's from the GSD, and is one of the founding principals of 360 Architecture together with Chris Bart. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Kyna Leski. I'm very excited for this talk.
Yay, that's beautiful. Thank you. Irini, for inviting me, and thank you, Alex, for introducing me. I wanted to start this lecture with my teacher, so it's kind of interesting that you're introduced me, because years after I finished Cooper Union, I hadn't thanked John Haydock for being my mentor. But so I finally wrote him a letter because I saw something that I did with my students that reminded me of what Haydock did for me. And so I finally was able to write him and said, I always was waiting to repay you somehow before I thanked you. But I realized that actually a true gift continues with a momentum and a direction, that it just keeps going in that way, that it cannot be reversed and brought back. And so with that realization, I was able to get in touch with John Haydock again. So with that, I want to just, if you don't know John Haydock, this is not a lecture on John Haydock, but it is his birthday today. So I have to show you just a little clip, which is just something that is online, and I have to find that screen. I don't know, maybe. Sorry, this is one more complicated thing. What are you guys seeing? Nothing yet. You're not seeing my screen. 1 second, sorry. Ooh. Oh gosh.
Take your time, no worries.
Sorry, it's
Coming.
how to get to this. I know how to share my screen for my presentation, but not this. Let's see if this will work. But I have to go to, you're seeing my email, correct? But now you're seeing this screen?
Yes.
You see the Haydock
Yes.
thing? Okay, I hope
How
you
do you
can
teach
hear 'em.
architecture? I never tell them what to do. In other words, draw what's
You can
inside
hear him?
them out and just hit at certain key points, and that they can then, you know, develop their ideas. I mean, that's it. I'm against that kind of didactic teaching that they're told exactly what to do all the time. A painter can be a purist, a sculptor can be a purist. Architects are not purists, that they deal only in approximations. Their art and science is the art and science of approximation. Right now, we're at a new edge in architecture. I cannot now do a building without building a repertoire of characters, of stories, of language, and it's all parallel. It's not just building per se. It's building worlds. It's building worlds.
Okay, so I show you that, and like everything that John Haydock said to me, it took a while to fully understand or to have it sink in. And that phrase about architecture being approximations always confused me. I wasn't sure about that. And I want to show you that I finally, with this lecture, think I understand what he meant. So John Haydock I also ask of you to always tell me if you can't hear the video or me or see something, because I have no other way of knowing. But John Haydock had on his wall this quote by Robbe-Grillet, where Robbe-Grillet was speaking about Franz Kafka. The hallucinatory effect derives from the extraordinary clarity, not from mystery or miss. Nothing is more fantastic ultimately than precision. And that made a lot of sense to us at Cooper, because we had 4 years, full years of structures. And if you saw the kinds of drawings we did, they were very precise, and they were very conceptually rigorous and clear. But so this idea about approximation wasn't clear to me, and until I realized that approximation is not the opposite of precision. Approximation is the act or process of drawing together. It is this coherence that we make, the meetings that we make. between material, between things, between yours and mine, between public and private, between here and there. And this is also, I'm thinking about that film that you were given, or the compilation of photos predominantly of La Jetée. And also, I just saw Human Capital, which is a kind of, I think in a way, a contemporary version that's similar to La Jetée, that there's this arc that we all live within of time, of the present, we're within it, but there's this arc that extends in terms of what we can anticipate into the future and where we come from, the knowledge we have of the past, and or maybe the story we tell, how far it extends. And that time travel is something that we're constantly revisiting. Every time we do a project, every time we have a dream, every time, you know, when you make a talk, you're constantly rewriting the story within this arc. And as the philosopher Hans Rune observed when I gave a talk in Sweden, we are becoming like the dragonfly, which has this incredible sensory capacity in the moment that is in contrast to this arc. You know, that we're getting more and more information, but we're also getting this deeper sense of time. And we situate ourselves in that. And we also are aware that someday we will be part of the past. So how do we write that story, and how is that time travel taken? So as Alex described and mentioned, I wrote this book, The Storm of Creativity, which used the storm as a metaphor for the creative process. You know, it's something that's cyclical. It's something that comes out of this field, which you're seeing right now. And it comes out of questioning and undoing and unknowing, you know, perhaps realizing what you thought you knew is not really the case. And that negative pressure starts to gather. It starts to gather from the fields.
Kyna, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we're still on the first slide.
Ah, well, yeah. Okay. How do I change that?
Try again.
Just share screen again. And all right. Maybe what I'll do is I'll put it onto place slideshow, and then I can't see my. Can you see that? And as I move ahead,
Perfect.
You can see the video now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. So this is what we were seeing, and maybe you can tell me if you hear the sound of how this beginning takes place coming out of the field, that the field elicits the beginning. Can you see all that, Alex? Alex, can you see the video?
Yes.
Okay. So it's cyclical, it gathers momentum, it converts potential energy into kinetic energy. The intention and direction of the storm, I don't think is always what we start with. It's something that emerges, but it does have an intention. It has one that clearly directs it. And it could be powerful, it could be something, a storm that, it could be a creative work that peters out, but it has consequences, usually creative, sometimes destructive. And it has a natural lifespan where what it's carrying reaches its limits and its energy is deployed. And the consequences, like I said, could be constructive or destructive, but it continues just as the hydrologic process continues and is contagious. And so I'm interested in this ground now, the ground from which the storm emerges. And so I see this now more as a trilogy of field, cloud, storm. And today I'm going to talk about field. And you still can see the new slides, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I have 3 episodes when talking about fields. One is this idea of cohering a world, which John Haydock spoke about. This is one of the gifts that he gave me that I guess is continuing and I didn't realize. Another is are the invisible guests that appear in a field, and the intention that we play to what is there. And as Alex said, the transsubjectivity of what we pay attention to and whether it's carries through into the work and speaks for you and is what others pay attention to as well. So first, with cohering a world, it's something that I think, as I said, and John Haydock said, it's what we do. For me, the model that you see that I made on the bottom left is a model I just made like a week ago. It's for a project that we have, and this is the only architecture project that I'm showing you, for a music school called Community Music Works. It's a CLT building that houses a performance hall and practice rooms and classrooms. It's a nonprofit school for students on the west side of Providence. And the model that I make, and each time we make these models for each project, they're very different. They're made out of different materials. They're highly edited. They are analytical. And I see them as kinds of the brain of the project, because as the project gets more and more complex, trying to communicate and resolve and identify as precisely as possible what the formative ideas are of the project. And so in this case, it's a center that's kind of a window for the community, and I would want one to have a sense when in the performance hall to not know exactly where its limits are. Acoustically, there are very clear boundaries where the sound does not permeate beyond certain walls and perimeters. But visually, the performance hall extends into the student lounge where the students can sit on this tiered seating, or beyond into a skylight above, or beyond to the street. And so that sense of this expanding and contracting sense of what the actual location of the school is the intention of the project. So to me, the best way to describe this idea of cohering a world came through this dream that I had that I wrote a story about, but I'm not going to read the whole story. I'll read part of it, but it's a story about a dream that I had many years ago. And I called that dream My Father's Garden. And this took place when I was in Rome. I started recording my dreams because they were very vivid. And it was a way of digesting my surroundings and what I was experiencing that I found to be fuller than sitting and drawing from life at that time. And there's many drawings that I've done while I was in Rome and then since then. And they are my ways of gathering, and a way of gathering things that are not only through my will, but other aspects that I am not clearly aware of. And they fuel the imagination. They fuel the imagination to live and feel a reality that is perhaps of equal weight to the one that we're in now in our waking life, but can act as a counterweight to sometimes escape the reality we're in to imagine another. And so this one dream I had was about leaving the house I grew up in and walking outside. And this is a quick sketch that I did when I woke up. And there was this garden filled with these rich planting beds, but instead the kinds that you usually see when you have vegetable gardens, but they weren't vegetables inside. They were freshly cut beds of earth. And they were in front of me on my left and my side and my right. And there was this stone border. But instead of having vegetables in it, there were body parts in it. And I didn't feel anything horrible. I just saw these cleanly cut elements of parts of bodies, like a foot or a leg. There was a brain, there was a spinal cord, and there were these two torsos that are hard to see in this image because they were quickly drawn with this fine veining pattern. It was very strange to me, that fine veining pattern. And everything was skewed because I could see what was in front of me and on my sides at one moment, which I had to somehow put on the page. And there was a bat, but I wasn't sure where that bat was, but I drew it anyway. So those are the torsos, the foot, the brain with the column. And then I did what I always do, which is I wrote the date, October 28th, and the title. And that's usually all that I write in terms of writing. So the next stage of the story is what happened a couple of days later on October 30th. I arrived at the Sistine Chapel for an appointment. I had been living in Rome as the academic head of an American program, which brought special privileges. Ezio Genovesi, the director of the program, arranged an appointment with Gianluigi Coalucci to see up close the restoration of Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Gianluigi Coalucci, a well-known restorer, was in charge of the 14-year restoration of the Sistine Chapel. He had completed the restoration of the vaulted ceiling and was near the completion of the Last Judgment, Michelangelo's painted fresco on the altar wall. The Last Judgment depicts the story of the Day of the Lord in Christian theology, the final and eternal judgment by God of all nations. It is told by St. John in Revelations through prophecy, an apocalyptic message that he received from Christ about the end of the world and judgment of soul's destiny. Apocalypse is a Greek word meaning revelation, an unveiling of things not previously known, which could not be known apart from the unveiling. The entire west wall of the chapel was shrouded by a tarp that hung on 7-tiered scaffolding. Ezio, his wife, and Gianluigi Coalucci and I met on the floor level of the chapel and started up a lift to the uppermost level. The chapel is tall, and some prominent figures are quite large, almost 3 meters tall. Each level offered partial views of their bodies. As the lift climbed, we passed slices of figures framed by scaffolding. We arrived and stood at the top corner where the restoration was complete. Here, the vaulted ceiling meets the end wall and the side walls in a cusp-shaped slice of vaulted ceiling where it meets the end wall and the side walls. It's called a pendentive. One could simultaneously see the end wall, the side wall, and the vault overhead. This painted pendentive depicted the Brazen Serpent, a story from the Book of Numbers, of the creation and of the sacred bronze snake called Nehushtan. From up close view, one could see that the figures are enormous and distorted, the shin of a leg reaching well over 1 meter long. Michelangelo's distorted the figures so that they would appear correct when viewed from the ground. I noticed a distant rectangular meter of the painting that had a dirty dark film covering it, an area left untouched by Coalucci's team, so that as the restoration techniques improve, specimens can be tested with the techniques of the day and compared. And then something above the pendentive of the Brazen Serpent caught my attention. 2 bronze nudes with torsos covered with a fine veining pattern. Signor Coalucci explained that the water damage from the roof formed microscopic tributaries carrying water to the surface of the fresco. As the water evaporated, salts were left on the surface, leaving a white crystalline effervescence. Vegetable oils and animal glues were applied in earlier restorations to make the white salt deposits transparent, but the effect was temporary and the goo collected dirt. Signor Coalucci cleaned away the dirt, but the damage from one salt, called saltpeter, could not be reversed. It leached from the mortar between the bricks of the vaulted ceiling, followed the fine cracks carved by water through the layers of fresco, causing an irreversible staining. That staining was the fine veining pattern on the torsos. Saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, was made from bat guano, accumulated in and collected from caves. I was struck with a physical memory which had no words, a sense of recognition that I had been here before. And then I realized I was standing in the image of the dream I had a few nights before. What I had seen in my dream as a spinal column and pelvis looked like the staff with the bronze serpent held by a hand wrapped by a snake. The rock and sand border looked like a painted border around the pendentives. The faceted corner composed of vault, pendentive, and side and end wall was similar to the simultaneously skewed planting beds that were ahead and on my sides in the dream. The thin film of mud looked like the film of the unclean area left by the restorers, and the veiny patterns of the torsos in my dreams looked like the veiny patterns of the bronze nudes. There was even a head of curly hair seen from behind that looked like a brain. Overwhelmed, I recounted the corresponding details of my father's garden and this upper corner of the Sistine Chapel to my small group. It seemed to make them uncomfortable, so we continued on our tour. The Last Judgment was painted as a true or buon fresco, a process of applying color to wet plaster and then finished in place a secco on dry plaster with the same color. The fresco is approximately 46 by 43 feet, made in increments called giornate, the area of wet plaster that can be completed in the span of a day. Up close, one can see the seams of the giornate. They fall along the lines of cartoons that Michelangelo prepared of parts of figures or grouping of figures, depending upon size and detail. The cartoons were transferred to the plaster with indirect engravings or by pouncing of points, a process called spolvero. The Last Judgment is a journal of 456 giornate, 456 sunrises and sunsets. These workdays are measured by the saturation and evaporation of the plaster, lime from sea creatures and pozzolana ash from the earth's mantle, days measured in humidifying the chapel and Michelangelo's lungs. We moved through the levels, negotiating areas of enclosed tents glowing with the restorer's lamps, seeing the swarming figures subjected to atmospheric pressure of ascension, suspension, or the pull downward by the demons below. At the bottommost level stands Sharon, oar in hand, manning a boat of the damned. Minos stands in the bottom right corner, wrapped in and bitten by a snake. A winged Lucifer chews on the ankle of one of the damned. Shown with raking light, one can clearly see the engraved lines used to transfer the images from cartoon to the wall. Lucifer's large wing extends across the hull of a boat, a wing that has claws at its tips. I asked, what kind of bird has claws at the end of its wings? A bat was the reply. I returned home and looked at my painted sketch. It was an uncanny set of visual field notes of our visit, and specifically of the close view of the upper corner pendentive. The paint had dried, and the subtle pigment left in the crevices of my erased sketch of the bat was no longer there. I painted the back in its place. What percolated through the layers of dream into day were partially drawn out, layer by excavated layer, incomplete mark and memory. The memory is more of a physical sensation of a being in a space than a crystal clear film. Entering the upper west corner of the Sistine Chapel was like entering the space of my dream. The second chapter is I called Invisible Guests, and it's inspired by this quote by the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. For our house is open, there are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will. So this is me in my thesis year at Cooper Union and Cooper Union itself. And one of the, John Haydock, I don't think ever used the word invisible guests, but he did tell us and teach us to be aware of the other and to include the other, which I think is another way of saying invisible guests. And I'm holding my thesis project there, but I want to show this project, which was in my second year. I was designing and fabricating an object to define an increment of time. And it involved this very lengthy or involved fabrication process of cutting the hyperbolic curve that represented my understanding of an increment of time, how 1 year in your first life is your whole life. In your second year of your life, it's half your life. In your third, a third. In your 50th, 1/50th of your life. So that increment, although it's calculated the same in a kind of non-sensory way, the sensation of it relative to yourself is very different and closer to the hyperbola. And so I cut that form and then turned the positive to build up this plaster and mold, which I then built up the layers of fiberglass to create this object where a ball would spin on the surface, always taking the same amount of time. And the reason why I'm showing this is because in the process of its making, the blade sometimes would chatter when I was turning the plaster mold. And you can hear that chattering even when the ball travels the surface. Or the humidity would cause a bubble to form between the layers of fiberglass. So what happens in the process of making, I believe, is there and it speaks for us. And it's much more involved than anything that I can name and quantify, and including invisible guests that get embedded and speak for us when the work is done. So this is something that John Hayek told me, because I won't go into it too far, but I had a bad review in my second year with Rick Scafidio and Liz Diller, although Liz Diller was supportive, but with George Rinaldi, and he said that I didn't know what I was doing when I presented this project. But then John Hayek said to me later, and he showed it to the author of Talk of the Town, that New Yorker article, who did an article, a column on this piece. He said to me, this piece, you must pursue that for the rest of your life. So I carried it around with me from house to house, and then I left it in an attic of where we lived once before. And I dug it out recently when I went over to see that it was still there in that house. And it was recorded, so just to give you a glimpse of how this thing performs. This was one of many, many footages of film that was taken by Dennis Helinsky, who had just retired from RISD. He's a filmmaker. There's many ways in which invisible guests appear, and to speak about one other, I'm going to tell you a little story, because as we all try to cohere our world, our stories include our family and what precedes us. And my father is one of the most influential people on my life and my life's work. And he was an architect. He was the right hand of Wallace K. Harrison, and he was the designer of the Metropolitan Opera House, of Exxon, Celanese, McGraw-Hill, and Time and Life on 6th Avenue, of the Cultural Center in Albany, and other projects for Harrison and Abramovitz. He was very gifted, and he used to make drawings, these very expressive, free, improvisational drawings that he worked very freely, as you can see here, and drawings that were more formed for presentation of this cultural center that he designed for Harrison. But he taught me also about the value of invisible guests, although he didn't use those words either, through this story about an accident that shaped the chandeliers that are famous in Lincoln Center in the Metropolitan Opera House, and how they came about. So my father was working on a drawing actually like this. It may have been this drawing, and a paint splat fell accidentally on the page just before a meeting. And there was a film recently made by Susan Fromke called The Opera House, about the making of the Opera House in Lincoln Center. And finally, for the first time, my father received credit, because there's a little, for his work for Wallace K. Harrison. So there's a little chapter in that film on my father. And I'm going to show you a clip from that film to tell the story of how the invisible guests in this project appeared.
One day,
can you hear that?
My father very characteristically is making a sketch,
Yes.
Mixed media, grabbing anything that's in front of him, and not only of conceiving of a design, but then quickly visualizing it. So he's drawing it in order to communicate to others for a meeting. And in the process of adding some finishing touches with paint, a splat happened on his perspective, and there was no time to really start over again because it was just before a meeting.
all this paint splashed on the drawing and created some quite nice elements, but in the middle of the drawing, like fireworks, you know. Well, Harrison came and said, "What did you do now? Rockefeller is waiting, Bing is waiting, everyone is waiting. Gosh, what shall we do now?"
So he quickly added some lines so that splotch of white paint could be refracted light from the chandelier. My father was nervous about that because Rockefeller and Harrison both were thinking that they would get a traditional design for a chandelier, and this clearly was something else.
And when I brought this, Rockefeller looked, and Bing also said, "Well, it looks very nice." I said, "That's what, but it isn't this white. Don't look at this white spots and so on. Look only at the drawing behind them." And I said, no, we are talking about that. Is it possible to do something like that? And Carson looked at me and I said, yes, of course we could do something.
There's a reason why everybody went, "Ah," even though they had other intentions. My father's intention was not to splash across the page. Harrison's intention was to respect Rockefeller's intention, which was to do a traditional chandelier. But they all went, "Ah, there's something that is shared, that's just in the air." And suddenly it started to assert itself as not just an accident, but as something that could be the beginning, the birth, the genesis of the design.
So this paint splat is interesting because, and the reason why I think it worked to cohere a consensus between the client, my father, his boss, and the funder, Rockefeller, is because at the same time in generating this chandelier, at the same time there was this telescope that enabled scientists to view the leftover radiation from the Big Bang. And that was really important because they were disputing theories about the origin of the universe. And previous to this telescope, one would only see blackness between the celestial bodies. And by seeing that radiation, there was proof that there was this force that was left over, and it changed the world's perception of the origin of the universe. And that affected everyone. It was in the news, but it also really affected this project because there was such a force to make the building traditional, as you can see with the arches. My father's idea was a little different than what you see there, but it did move the project in a progressive way of trying to make a new cultural center for New York City. And it also budged Harrison, who was educated in the Beaux-Arts. My father was a younger generation. And so there was a real shift of consensus that all cohered about this explosive geometry that was seen and recognized in that paint splash. So the last aspect of the field is, how an intention arises, not the intention that you start with. And what was interesting is to find out that the etymological root of intention is the same as attentive. It comes from tendere, to stretch the mind towards. So what we're paying attention to, and it's very often in very little things. It could be, like that paint splat was probably catastrophic at that moment. We were about to meet Rockefeller with the project, but there are these little things that happen along the way that catch our eye. And we each have a signature way of observing and paying attention. And I like the blind contour problem that we give in drawing from observation classes, because you don't look at the page, you look at what you're looking at in your drawing. And it ends up being this kind of almost like a EKG, a register of how you observe. And there really is a signature between one person's way of seeing and another. And this painting by the Russian painter Ilya Repin, The Unexpected Visitor, is a painting of glances. And it's not just how much they receive, it's also how much they emit and project in a conversation of glances. how powerful that is, and not only our signature way of seeing it, but also of receiving, but also of emitting. And it was used by this scientist, Alfred Yarbus, who was studying the eye movements. He also was really, but as a scientist, interested in the way in which we see and the saccades, that very quick motion that our eyes are constantly flickering as we change focus and move from one point to another. So he created this device that his subjects wore, and he traced the viewing of this painting based on 7 different subjects, which is what you see on the left page. Their signature ways of seeing were drawn out, which were different from one to the next. And then the second page is his recording the same subject's way of viewing, but over time. Not saying anything, just putting those device on the subject's eyes and recording how they see, one day, an hour later, the next week, a month later, etc. But then what's so interesting to me is how the last page reveals the effect of a question on a subject. It's the same subject this time, but the subject is being asked questions like, what do you think the relationships of these individuals are? Where do you think the visitor is coming from, etc.? What social class do you think they are situated in? And you can see how radically different the way we observe is when we're affected by the question. And those questions can be external, or they can be our own questions. But there is something that, there's a kind of tug of war of an innate signature, and then the one that engages the other through questions that may come from outside. One of the biggest influences on my understanding of all of this, of the creative process, of the creative ground, of the field, is this book by the poet Francis Ponge, a French poet, and it's called The Making of the Prey. It's a book which is an edited manuscript. The poem itself he refers to as an essay, which is at the end of the book. But this book is a very edited manuscript of his notes in writing the Prey. And pré apparently means meadow in French, but it also is the prefix of prefix, and it's present and present. It's a generative beginning of a ground that's just still soft and alive, and it has enough integrity to oppose one's weight. It's mineral, it's animal, it's vegetal. And that you can see here, this is an example of the book translated on the right, the transcription translated, and on the left his actual notes. And so you can watch how he forms the prey and how it is made. You can see how it's almost like a journal of its making. And so I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I wanted to make my own field. And I was inspired by this little patch of clover that I saw on a sidewalk here in Providence. But I'm going to show you this because it does involve, I think, transsubjectivity. What things that I noticed as I was making it. One rule I had is never to go backwards. And I didn't know I was going to make an animation out of this. I just started recording with my cell phone its making. But there's things that catch your eye that maybe are the same that caught mine. And this is, I'm going to just jump right into it because this is the middle of the video that I made. I think I stopped shared, correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Oh, there's some talk, there's some questions here.
Kyna, thank you so much for your presentation. This like segues so well for us in our program, our brief on transformation of the unconscious. There are a handful of questions already, but any of us panelists have any questions to start?
Yeah, I can maybe kick it off. Thank you so much. Really excellent lecture. I had a lot of fun, and it really inspired and related to a lot of things that I was thinking about, and now I'm thinking about. I've seen the film, the John Haydock Builder of Worlds, I think it's called. And just like you mentioned with the Michelangelo sort of coincidence, there's this great moment where he talks about how he had a sort of model or maquette of the human body, deconstructed that you might find in a biology class, and that there's this one piece that he couldn't fit. And then a few months later, or maybe a couple of years later, I'm probably butchering the story, I can't tell it as well as he could, but basically that he became very sick, and the thing that was making him sick was the one piece of his body that he couldn't reconstruct into the model. And I watched that a couple months ago, and I thought it was like, very perplexing, because I have, just like you and everyone here, the constant sensation of always being put into a moment of coincidence. So, for example, if I'm working on a project at school and I go to a museum, almost 100% of the time, it doesn't really matter what painting it is, there will always be something that relates into my own narrative. And so I think that relates to the concept of attentiveness and intention, because it's sort of our ability to hear the field of all possibility, the field of all sort of creative potential, basically. I have a question about objecthood and objects. I think a lot about John Haydock's sort of characters, these like inhabitable bodies, and I can never understand really what they are, because they're objects that have some sort of immutable personality to them. I'm wondering about how you think about that in particular, and about objects as they relate to the field as you've.
Objects as they relate to the field. Well, I'm probably going to give too conceptual an answer, but there's a physicist who is an alternative physicist whose work I'm blown away by, and it's actually, his work is called field structure theory, and his name is Don Bradell. And he demonstrates how energy creates objects, and that the field is what creates the objects. The objects are not in the field. But it's almost as, he literally makes knots to demonstrate how the field, he creates a knot out of the field and can create any form doing this. And I'm not speaking virtually, I mean with physical things that I've seen and I actually have a model of. So to me, that resonates in, I'm starting to hear myself, that resonates most clearly, is that the field is the object is holding the field, and maybe that is why Haydock, his mind took him to that part of the body. I think it may have been his pancreas, I'm not sure, but the organ that he couldn't fit back into his anatomical doll, that there's, and it's not something that we're fully aware of, but we can become more aware of. And I don't mean to say anything that's, supernatural at all. It's just, it's about extending our awareness to things that are already there and not discounting them and being more attentive to them. you know, and especially not discounting them, because very often they're very quiet little things that happen in the process of creating a work, designing a building, that we dismiss because those questions that, especially from the outside, are so loud, you know, that they detour our, if there is this kind of cohering that we're doing in our lifetime and through our work, that does have an arc of time that extends, and it's part of our project, right, of being here, you know. That's our lens through which we focus things. And it does expand, right, with the other. It does expand through questions that others give you, but it also may distract from certain things that you will notice, like when Katie Payne, the scientist, you know, felt the air shudder and recorded when she was around a bunch of elephants, and then she recorded it and sped up the tape recording, and you could hear the elephants speaking, which you could not hear when it was at a slow speed. And she's therefore, by doing that, discovered this highly complex language of elephants. And so that sense of like feeling the air shudder is just so subtle, right? And it's particular to her biography because she used to work in a church when setting up the organ, and she would feel the organs at the lower register causing the air to shudder. So there's something very, very particular about our lenses. And it's, you know, I don't pretend to explain it, but I have seen it in individuals and others and myself. And I think Hayduk, I was going to show you my thesis project, but I had this little tiny model of an idea of the site, and I had cast out of lead a tetrahedron, and it was sitting on my desk. And he said to me, he was in the thesis room, and he walked by my desk, and then he walked away about 10 feet and said, Kyna, I won't imitate him, but he says, Kyna, look, that's it. Nothing more, nothing less. Do you understand what I'm saying, Kyna? And it's very, I mean, that was the project, he was saying. You don't have to go any further. It was a little thing to notice that was the full scope of the project. And it's actually the way I teach now. Like there's a lot more time that you spend, which is kind of a psychological preparation for delivering a message, but it really is about, you know, it usually happens that quickly in terms of noting something that has a density that holds in the object, the field that this individual has been cultivating, you know, over many weeks, that it can be as quick as that. And sometimes, you know, there's a battle with the author themselves to recognize it. I kind of went a little too long about your question, but.
Thank you.
Kyna, I would like to just thank you for a fantastic talk, and also say that the students are given the charge of making a video, and I loved your 2 videos. They were fantastic. So also I would have to say to the students, be careful of the sound, because when you're making a video, there needs to be some, either it's silent or there's some parallel. And I thought that your animated drawing, I don't know who the composer was, but that music was fabulous, and it was pixelated like what was going on in the artwork. And I think that's something kind of difficult to do in such a short period that they're working now, just 3 weeks. So don't have any sound or music on tomorrow, because it's the midterm review. So, but at the end, it's going to be difficult. She did it really beautifully. I mean, also the sound in that piece of artwork what was the soundtrack in that piece of artwork where there are these ball bearings running down the horn?
It was actually the sound of the ball bearings themselves.
Wow.
And the first one was, thank you, Stephen. And the first one was this composer, Forrest Larson, here in Providence, who did that whole piece on a comb. He just plucked a comb. I think he was responding to the low tech way in which that animation was drawn with, you know, a pen, black pen on trace paper. And the last piece actually, I mean, Zoe Keating is an amazing, I met her and her piece, most recent piece just fused with the animation, I thought, so well. So she agreed to have it
Sure. So you know this composer, Zoe Keating?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
We need to get her for T-Space. You
Oh,
know,
yeah.
we do
That's a
every
great
year we
idea,
have. Yeah. Well, Irina can follow up on that a little bit. But I don't want to. I'm going to mute myself because it's for the students. But thank you so much.
Thank
Beautiful.
you. Thank you so much.
Kyna, I have a question that kind of came out of Jack's question. I have been studying Carl Jung for most of my adult life, just out of curiosity, and revisited a lot of his work for this project. And he talks about the concept of synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle.
Exactly.
It's something that is totally unintentional, yet we assign from our own psyche, we assign meaning. And that's kind of what I'm gathering out of this this kind of like exploration of process. And it makes me think of Andre Breton, the father of surrealism, and he constantly talked about the inability of some people to imagine things. If I think one of his quotes is, "If you can't imagine a horse dancing on a tomato, then you're a fool," something to that effect. But the idea that we pay so much attention to the physical things in front of us, and that's what we assign value to. But the creative process is the opposite of that. And I don't know if you could speak a little bit to your own experience of this. I mean, you've done this, but discovering your own kind of metaphors within your mind that start to reveal themselves through your creative process.
Well, I mean, I am very moved by Jung's work and his own paintings of his dreams, which I'm sure you are aware of, the Red Book. And also, I think the reason why I tried to maybe show too much of that initial dream was I was really just reporting, not trying to say anything more other than my experience, which is there. But I was trying to do this kind of tracking down the meaning, right? You know, like looking at the materials that Michelangelo used, looking at the materials that are causing that veiny pattern, you know, the mortar in the roof. I mean, actually, there's a little question here from Nicholas Evans Cato, who's probably he's a professor at RISD in foundation studies. And I don't know of a better person than Nicholas in terms of this kind of hunt that we engage in to understand what it is we're working with. And so this hunting actually is, to me, it's this kind of oscillating around something. You know, it's actually, it is the true meaning of hunting, is oscillation. Like when you are making something on a lathe, you know, there is this something that you're trying to get to, and you sense it, but it's not directly there. I don't know if it's always a metaphor, you know, but and this is where there's this sensation of time travel to me, which is very strange, because when something does arrive and appear, you know, seemingly out of the blue, but out of your process, and it catches your eye, you recognize it. And I don't know about anyone else. I'm really curious if others feel this sensation that I feel when an idea arrives. I mean arrive, you know, it's elicited from the field. It's not something that I go, I want this, and it's a result of an algorithm or whatever but when something really appears, I recognize it, and I have the sensation of it's familiar, you know, almost like someone I knew. It's like, you know, the same way as if you're traveling in a foreign city and you see somebody that you didn't plan on seeing and you bump into them, but you recognize them out of this blue. And it's a very strange sense of familiarity. And how can you feel familiar with something that you don't yet know, but obviously we must know it in some way that we're not aware of, because it gives you this sense of time travel, you know? So to me, we're always hunting around, we're always oscillating around something and trying to get closer to it until it appears. I don't know if I did a good job on that, but you know, and those moments of synchronicity might be where there's a jump, you know, where there's a sudden shift, of that process and its speed or its time. I don't know, but and that's what throws us, and it seems completely acausal, or at least from our perspective. We might be intersecting something else, which is a causal set of relationships, but we're intersecting it from our point of view. It's not something that we caused or we're aware of the cause.
Thank you. Any other questions from the panelists?
If I may say something on oscillation, there's this Richard Seltzer quote. Richard Seltzer, the surgeon and writer, and you said, Kyna, as well, that I mean, Hayduk was the one who brought Seltzer into the discussion, and Seltzer says, "Where is the architect who, without sacrificing function and practicality, will think of the hospital as a pregnant woman who suffers the occupancy of a human being who enters, dwells for a time, and ultimately passes forth? Where is the architect who, from the very moment he begins his design, will be aware that in each room of his finished hospital someone will die, who will, seated at his drawing board, will pause to feel upon his naked forearms the chill wind of his mortality? One day he too will enter this building, not as its architect, but as a supplicant in direst need." And then on Friday, we had Alberto Campo Baeza do a talk where one of his great quotes was that we shouldn't be neurotic. We shouldn't be the architects who just constantly work and are in our own minds when we go to sleep. And then in your lecture, you're drawing from so many different disciplines of science, of history, of philosophy, to draw all of this into the orbit of architecture. And so I want to thank you for showing us this way. And it was a huge privilege for me to be a student of yours and to be constantly on this search to not prescribe the project from the very beginning, to try to pull in different disciplines into that orbit of the making of architecture. And I mean, that's also one of the chapters in your book, is that we link things together. We find different moments that start to densify the actual project at hand, and so that this is this oscillation process, this constant working and stepping back for a moment and understanding the project at hand, and to develop it in this way. And for me, this is what I took away from your talk and from your teaching, from your book, and from the way that you conduct architecture. And now for us as young students, architecture sometimes feel like a bit of a confused discipline. There's so many varying ideas, so many things out there that people are doing, and so it's really fantastically mind-blowing to be a student of yours and of the people that are in your orbit. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And you also, I think you did a good job of answering one of Nicholas Evans Cato's questions about, as an architect, do you find that a client is an uninvited guest who you are obligated to invite? I mean, the quote that you gave of Seltzer is a perfect, I think, yes, is an uninvited, and yourself, guest who you are obligated to invite. So thank you for that.
Any more questions? Kyna, would you maybe do us another favor? You've done us so many already today, but if there was maybe something that you tell your students before they go into this second half of the phase of a project, could you give us that in closing?
Well, all I can do is give my experience where, one of the things that I look out for when I sit at a student's desk and I look at their work is sometimes you can read emotion in the things that people make. And I noticed that very often, in the same way that we fight to remember, I'm sorry if you can hear our dogs, but if there's this kind of battle to forget your dreams when you wake up, I think that's common. You have to work to remember them. And there's a whole psychology of dismissing it constantly. You know, oh, that's stupid. Why bother with that? And there's something like that, analogous to that, comes with working as well. And I notice I can sort of sense when a work is being cast aside because it's almost hated, because it's awkward, and it may be new, it may be unexpected, it might not be what you intended. And I hear it all the time from beginning students, especially, will say things like, well, actually, that's not what I wanted to do. You know, and so it's a battle against the emergent idea and its awkwardness and its unfamiliarity at first, and it's not being what you wanted. So, I mean, I don't know if that's coming halfway, but that's, you know, I sometimes I see these things that are made that are cast on the floor that are closer to what someone's looking for, you know, and that we go through a process of substantiating maybe even our very first thoughts because we don't trust them, which is not a bad thing, because everything should be questioned, especially in architecture, because it is serving others and not ourselves. So I don't know if this is the right juncture for that, but the other thing that I think is a good is keeping the momentum, which might mean when you leave your desk, prepare it for the next time you get there, so that you don't go through that whole process of like going through the same thoughts again and again. You know, set up the paper that you need or the materials you need and the resources you need. Just take the extra 5 minutes to do that, so that you don't go through that cycle of doubt, which always comes in after you leave something. It's not something, I don't think we have doubt when we're in front of something. It's always after we leave it that doubt rushes in. So I don't know if it's where you're at now, but those are a couple of things, little helpful hints.
I know that I can apply that myself. I'm sure all of us can. Thank you so much.
Sure, yes. Thank you so much, Kyna, and we're very excited to have you in our final presentations, which are already coming up next week. So yes. We will see you then again, and this is an open invitation to all our attendees. I will put the link in the chat. If you'd like to register, you're more than welcome to join us next week and join the discussion. Kyna, this was fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming and such engaging questions. And thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Alex, for introducing me and for your help, Maxwell. So thank you all. I'll see you soon. I'm actually going to see you on my birthday. Today's Hedek's birthday, and I'll
that's good to know.
Okay.
Oh, we'll do a special treat for you, Kyna.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.